It's a weekend loads of us have been crying out for. A weekend where women's sport takes centre stage. Across the country and across the leagues, the inaugural Women's Football Weekend will be attracting fans into the grounds and to the TV. Whether you're a new fan or you've been following it for a while, there's so much to be excited about. It should have a striking impact on the women's game in this country. We just hope it's not quite as striking as Myles Garrett's swing. Welcome to SportSpiel. Yes, hello listeners, and welcome to our November discussion episode. As ever, we're here in King's Place, and I am joined by a moustache-wearing Will Moulton.
You love it.
I mean, it's a very faint one at the moment, but...
Well, there's two reasons for that. One is because it's ginger, and two is because it needs a shave around the outsides. So once the stubble on the chin has gone, then it will be more visible for the...
More full.
And when I do an Instagram post later, I will also put a filter on it to slightly enhance it. Just a little tiny bit.
The powers of Instagram. Anyway, how has life been, considering just over a week ago now, we were at Wembley as part of that record-breaking crowd.
We were, and what a couple of seats we had as well.
Great seats.
We certainly lucked out there.
Unfortunately, the performance didn't quite match those seats.
Yeah, but...
You were trying to think of a nice way to say it.
There were good bits of the performance. It was just the start and the end that weren't very good.
Sort of the first 25 minutes and then the final 15 minutes.
Yeah.
I'm trying to blank from my memory.
But in the middle, Germany offered no threat. England's offered more of a threat, but it was a bit sort of predictable at times. But and it's a difficult period for the team at the moment, but hopefully it'll all be sorted come 2021 and the Euros, and then they'll go and win something.
Fingers crossed. But as performance aside, the occasion itself was very good.
The atmosphere was incredible, wasn't it?
Exactly. And we've been to quite a few women's sports events in our time. And I think this is something that's been replicated a lot across a lot of people who went that day, is that finally we get to see what an atmosphere like that can do for an event. Because so often that's what we've been crying out for, and it's so deserved for something like that.
It did feel slightly like the players on the pitch were slightly overawed by it at the start. England have been notoriously slow starters anyway for the last few games. The Czech Republic game a few days later was a prime example of that. But, yeah, can we just see that at every women's sport event now, please?
Would be good. We had a very big women's sport discussion last night because last night, of course, it was the Offside Rule podcast social. And we went and played some crazy golf in Shoreditch. This is my moment to say that I won the first round of crazy golf before not losing, but coming third in the second round.
Out of how many?
So we were split up into two groups. So my group of 6. Top of that. There were 12 of us in total, and we did it in different stages. But a very good night out for Offside Rule Co. and chatting about... That's the thing we mentioned yesterday, is that we didn't talk about men's football once. All of our discussion was about women's football, which is very refreshing and shows where we are at the moment.
There also isn't much to talk about in the world of men's football at the moment. There's more to talk about in the world of women's football.
As we shall get onto later. Nice segue into today's episode, because we've got 2 topics to pick apart today. First, as we've alluded to, we're going to talk about the Women's Football Weekend, which is this weekend, and also we're going to be picking apart what it means for the sport and how it's going to change things going forward. We'll then talk about how you tackle major breaches of discipline. That's after NFL player Myles Garrett smacked an opposition player over the head with his own helmet, something I alluded to in the intro there, and that's a move that has earned him an indefinite suspension from the league. All of that is to come after this quick break.
You're listening to SportSpiel, the Players Podcast.
This weekend is the Women's Football Weekend, a chance to showcase the game and promote it like never before. Following on from last weekend's record-breaking crowd at Wembley Stadium, the inaugural Women's Football Weekend initiative looks to follow in the footsteps of non-league day. The timing here is key. We are in a men's international break, so there's no Premier League or Championship games to distract anyone. It also means more games will be held in men's teams' home stadiums. The North London derby, for example, between Tottenham and Arsenal is at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, and that could, in theory, beat the WSL attendance record set at the Etihad Stadium at the start of the season in the Manchester derby, although we should actually know the answer to that once this podcast goes out this evening. The Guardian is also reporting that Liverpool are set to welcome between 15,000 and 20,000 fans to Anfield for their derby, while Brighton will host Birmingham at the Amex and Reading will play Bristol City at the Madejski Stadium. So, my first question, how come not every team has opted to play their games at their men's stadium? Because Man City are playing right now as we record against West Ham, but they're doing it at their normal Academy Stadium home, and Chelsea are playing Manchester United at Kingsmeadow.
Both of those teams opened the start of the season by playing at the men's grounds, didn't they? Man City and Chelsea both played at the Etihad and Stamford Bridge on the same weekend, and clearly, for whatever reason, they've only decided that they can host a game like that in a different stadium once this season, and therefore that weekend has taken priority and they've not done it this weekend. When was the initiative for the Women's Football Weekend introduced? Was it introduced after teams had already said they were going to be playing the opening rounds at the men's stadiums?
It was, if memory serves me right, yes. Although I think the plans for it had been in place way before, but it wasn't actually announced until after.
Because it just does feel like it's a good idea, but it doesn't feel like it's been as executed as well as it could have been. And this is an example of it, that not every team is taking their game to a men's stadium. And it's not just a women's football weekend in the WSL as well, it's women's football across the whole entire spectrum. So Championship teams as well are hosting events. Northern and Southern Premier League teams, so my team Sunderland, were due to be playing Derby at the Hetton Centre this weekend. Unfortunately, that has been postponed because of a waterlogged pitch. And also, with the timing of it as well, so much energy and effort has been put in by the FA into promoting the game at Wembley last week and tried to get the record crowd there. It feels like this event had almost been forgotten about, and then everyone went, after last Saturday, everyone sort of thought, oh yeah, we've got this big women's football weekend, and then have sort of been talking about it since. And I work in the same building as Reading Football Club, so I've seen their advertisements around Bisham Abbey a bit more than others. But in terms of the media, it feels like this has almost been a forgotten about event. So I just question. I think it's a great idea, but I just think it's not been executed as well as it could have been, and its timing isn't necessarily as optimal as it could have been.
But then I suppose my more striking example is what happened with the Tottenham press conference this week, where it was supposedly cancelled because of a lack of interest from media outlets, which for me is the most depressing side of it, because I fail to see how there isn't enough interest across the board, because for me you need to look at more than just your mainstream media groups. So as great as it is to have the likes of the BBC and BT Sport on it, there's tons of independent vloggers, bloggers, independent sports media websites.
Us.
Thanks for that. Who would have been happy to go. And it's just about recognising the role that they can play as well, and making sure those invites are put out to those people too. So long as it's put out there in some sort of medium, in some way, in some form, that can only do the world of good. And I don't understand why it's not been done that way. Or if you are a big media outlet with lots of resources, why haven't you taken this opportunity to send a junior reporter or send someone on work experience and see what they can do? It presents an opportunity for the game to be promoted, but also presents an opportunity for those up and coming to showcase what they can do as well.
it was a really strange one because of all the games that were going to have that issue with this weekend, you wouldn't have thought the Spurs game.
That's the headliner.
It's the biggest game this weekend. That and the Merseyside derby as well. It's a strange one. It's difficult being in a company where we host press days. It can be difficult to attract the biggest names to a press day. And you do have to help out. You encourage the local media to come down, and you'll have your press lists. And you'd imagine they would have sent a press release out to these lists saying we're doing this on this day at this time. And then if you are struggling for numbers, it's sort of up to you to chase it, and it's up to you to try and find outlets. And it feels like that Spurs perhaps maybe haven't done that, but because they are so new to women's football, the top tier of women's football, perhaps, and they just haven't quite grasped that actually sometimes how hard you need to work to keep people interested, because we find at Great Britain Hockey that for getting people to come to a media day before most tournaments, apart from one or two very dedicated reporters who are always there, always asking questions, and the local papers who we've got good relationships with, it's really difficult. But we know that we have to chase them and keep reminding them and make it as easy for them as possible, and perhaps Spurs just didn't do that because they weren't quite sure how it was going to happen. It's a difficult one to try and comprehend, and it could just be down to naivety rather than a lack of effort on Spurs' part, is what I'm trying to say, I think.
But you're as the comms person on this podcast, and then me sitting from sort of the local news standpoint, it is difficult to get reporters from that level down to something like that, just purely because of resource, because we're not alone in that we simply do not have enough people to cover everything that people want covered. We'll max have like 4 or 5 reporters in one day, and then if you've got a court story or a breaking story, then that needs to be covered over some other things, which is why I think the vlogger independent media outlet is kind of being overlooked here, because that is something that maybe isn't being pushed as much, but has so much potential in generating that publicity on social media or YouTube or something like that. Because for too long we seem to be focusing on your traditional big players in media and your local papers, but it's a changing industry all the time, and more and more blogs are sprouting up all the time, and more podcasts are sprouting up all the time as well. So kind of need to change, not so much look elsewhere, but remember that there's a whole separate other group waiting to be tapped into.
I think what people don't necessarily understand with the likes of blogs and podcasts is people, I think, still think it can take time, and that actually, you invite a podcaster down, but it might not go out for a couple of weeks. But actually, with the way the technology is nowadays, we're recording this today. This is going to go out
today,
this evening. It isn't too difficult to get things out the same day or the next day, as long as that's all you're focusing on. And I think it's people understanding that a bit more, and also, athletes quite often like a bit of a longer, more relaxed interview as well. They wouldn't mind doing a podcast, so I don't know.
Not wanting to blow our trumpet or anything, but that is what we hear a lot of the time.
And also because it gives them a chance to feel a bit more relaxed. They don't feel as much pressure. They feel like the podcast sort of genre and the blog genre often go away from the immediate pressure of the game, so you can actually get a more personable answer out of them. Whereas if you're just asking how you're preparing for this weekend's game, it's a question that they'll have been prepared for and know exactly what to say. Whereas if you have a bit more of a relaxed route, then you can actually get some better stories out of your players, and that is a way of getting better stories into the media, which actually attracts more attention. If you turn up to a press conference, you've just got the manager sitting behind a desk and 15 people in chairs asking him the same questions, you're not going to get a very personable answer. Whereas actually, if you invite these sort of newer media outlets down who do a little bit more digging into the personal lives, but actually generate some more personable stories and things that people can relate to and things that people want to read about, then could be the way forwards.
Increased engagement.
Saying.
Just putting it out there. For the record, it is currently 4-0 Man City West Ham, so happy days there. Ellen White's got the 4th goal, so that's 2 for her and 2 for Georgia Stanway. God knows what the score will be by the time we're done.
How long has gone?
The second half has just begun.
Ouch.
Anyway, we'll turn to some positives, because I know we've started off relatively negative, but we do have a lot of positive things to say about this women's football weekend, because first and foremost, I think the idea of it and the idea of this big weekend to celebrate it like non-league day does is a perfect platform to build from. I know it's the first one and there's plenty of things we can learn from this time around, but the concept I think is right. And I mean, we'll talk a bit about the attendances and the big men's stadium showcases that we've seen already, because it seems to be having a big benefit long term for attendances in the WSL, because we're 5 rounds now into the 22 match season, and the cumulative attendance is already better than the entirety of last season. Granted, there is one extra team in the WSL compared to last season as well, but we're already, not including today's or this weekend's stats, 119,248 this year compared to 106,960 all of last campaign. So these big events, thrusting it in people's faces in every way possible, is working in terms of getting more fans in and getting them to stick around as well.
It's working for certain teams. I think that is one point to say here, that Bristol City, first game of the season, hosted a game at Ashton Gate, and that attendance wasn't particularly spectacular. I don't think Reading women's attendances at the Midyeski have been pretty spectacular. And in the Championship, a couple of teams have gone to their main stadiums. Charlton went to the Valley, and that was a very bad attendance. So it's working for certain teams, but it's not working for others. But what I think the positive has been is the statistic around the numbers of people attending games at the regular stadiums, which is up 47% on last season, which I think is the statistic we actually need to be focusing on, because it's all well and good attracting 40,000 to the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium to watch the North London derby, but how many of those are going to go back the following week or the next time Spurs are playing at the Hive, which is where Barnet play, I think? How many people are going there? And by the looks of it, more people are attending the games in the regular stadiums. And I think the example always used at the moment is the Chelsea-Arsenal game at Kingsmeadow has attracted more fans than quite a few Wimbledon games this season. So I think that's where we are seeing the positives. And for certain clubs, having the games in the bigger stadiums are also proving effective.
Like I say, the 47% increase, great statistic to throw around. I think in the Championship, overall attendances are down by like 20%, but that's because Man United and
Spurs have been promoted.
Exactly, who had 2 of the biggest attendances in that division anyway. Would it have been better for this weekend to have more of an even spread over the Saturday and the Sunday? Because here we are on the Sunday and pretty much most of the games are being played today.
I don't necessarily think so. You're not going to get many fans who are going to be able to go to 2 matches on the Saturday and the Sunday. I think having all the games on one day is like a big extravaganza is not the issue. I think the issue is having it a week after you've spent so much time and effort trying to get the biggest England crowd ever, and only giving yourselves effectively a week to prepare people for this weekend. I think that is more of an issue than not spread out the games, in my opinion.
I think probably the most important bit is the community engagement as well, and seeing that filter through, because it's something personally speaking, I don't want the women's game to lose that connection with fans that you can argue the men's game at the elite level has lost, because there is a great disconnect there, whereas women's football has so much more of a connection with your match day going fan, because you get so much more out of that experience, i.e. a chance for a selfie or an autograph or anything like that. One of the more striking examples of that I picked up in the last couple of weeks was Bobby Zamora, former Brighton, West Ham, Fulham striker, and he's club ambassador now for Brighton, and he took his daughter to one of the Brighton's women's games, and his daughter has been totally hooked and now wants to be a footballer off the back of watching the women play. It's not off the back of what Daddy does, it's off the back of seeing women out there and having girls being able to see that and can relate to it, and that's something now for them to aspire to as well. That's that link between the fans that I think is really key here, and what I think they predominantly got right this weekend.
Definitely, and I think I always love it when you go on to social media after a WSL round and you see that players are retweeting and commenting on posts that people have put up saying thank you so much for the photo, thank you for coming to speak to us. And I don't know if it's because I follow a lot of them, but I see it a lot with the Reading players especially, and the Spurs players. But I think
with West Ham players then, but obviously that's because
and the Man City players I know do it as well, and I'm sure all clubs do it. And I think there's definitely that community engagement and the engagement with the fans that is really one of the strong points of not just women's football but a number of women's sports at the moment. I know the Red Roses, the England rugby team, are really, really good at that sort of thing as well. So yeah, it's just keeping them grounded, I guess, and keeping that level of engagement with the fans, but also increasing the professional standards of the game. It's a fine balancing act, but they can look at where other sports have got it right or got it wrong, like such as men's football. So it's great. And another example we had, I don't know if you heard it, but there was a father and a young daughter behind us at Wembley last week, and constantly throughout the game she was just asking him questions. And he was just explaining the game to her, but she was picking it up really quickly, and she was saying, "Oh, why didn't she pass there? Why didn't she pass there?" I remember at one point her turning around saying, "Daddy, I think I want to be a goalkeeper. Can we go and play when I get home?" And Daddy was like, "I don't think we can play as soon as we get home because it will be past your bedtime, but we'll play tomorrow." So that's the sort of thing that I thought it was really heartwarming to hear, and hopefully that will continue for a long time to come.
And I did pick up on that next to the crazy fan to my right, who was very engrossed in what was going on.
Yes,
but no, him and his daughter behind us. Just when he was sat explaining what a yellow card means and what a red card means and how to take a throw in, and you could tell she was just so engrossed in everything, and just all the little rules. And she's going to be a footballer in the near future. If she's not already found a team this weekend, she will be very soon, and that's fundamentally what this whole thing is about. So more initiatives like this, I think, are only a positive. Do we see this becoming more of a regular thing, or should it stay as sort of a one barnstorming weekend every season going forward? Because I suppose there's the fine balance of not oversaturating it so that it doesn't become a special occasion.
If you do, I think it's at the moment you start off with one or two a season, like Harlequins women have done with the Game Changer. They had the first 3 seasons just one game a season, taking the women's team to the Stoop, trying to break a record attendance. But then this season they've subsequently got a few more games at the Stoop, but they still have the Game Changer as well. So I think for the moment, just to get things going, this one big event a season, but going forwards, making it more of a regular thing as the success builds.
What more needs to happen? Do we need to see more from men's teams, for example? Because that's often something that gets put out there, whether it's the support or the promotion on their social media channels or at their games as well. Some are very good at it, but it's not across the board.
It feels like this has sort of been thrown together and they haven't had much time to do a lot of good promotional content. All I've seen this week is sort of a few graphics and that knocking around, but I again, using the Harlequins example, before the big Game Changer last season, they put out this really cool video about what they were trying to do, and that's the sort of content that gets people excited in the weeks leading up to it. So I think in the future, when they have an idea of exactly when they're going to do it and what they're going to do, and it's a bit more, there are more plans in place, getting more promotional content out, creating a specific hashtag that builds up to the weekend, really promotes it, and getting all the clubs behind it, giving them messages and their own giving them messages and encouraging them to create their own content to promote the weekend, and really putting a big effort and a lot of money behind it. Whereas I think this time round, like I said, the money and the effort was being put on the international team. Next time, focusing solely on this to just make it as big as possible, and I think it will be a huge success.
I think we both agree, a positive start, but a lot more to A, learn from, and then B, take forward and make it even better for when we next have a women's football weekend. So that is that for part 1. We'll take a slightly different turn and talk about discipline in part 2, just after this.
Make sure you follow SportSpiel on social media. Search for SportSpiel Pod on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or on LinkedIn.
In part 2 of today's episode, we're looking at serious breaches of discipline and what on earth you can do if an athlete falls well short of what is expected of them. What prompts this question is the impromptu game of on-field whack-a-mole that we witnessed on Thursday night in the NFL. For those who didn't see this incident, Myles Garrett of the Cleveland Browns ripped off the helmet of Pittsburgh Steelers quarterback Mason Rudolph before hitting him over the head with it. It happened with just 8 seconds of the game remaining, and Fox commentator Joe Buck described it as one of the worst things I've ever seen on a professional sports field. It's a move that could legitimately have threatened Rudolph's life as well, when you think how heavy an NFL helmet actually is. Garrett issued an apology the day after and was then suspended indefinitely by the NFL for the attack. He is suspended for at least the remainder of this season, and he will not be paid during that ban. He will only be reinstated with the approval of NFL officials. So all this brings into question, what do you do with these players, many of whom are big money commodities? And this got me thinking as well about the incident earlier this season involving Derby County players, Richard Keogh, Tom Lawrence and Mason Bennett, where they were involved in a drink driving crash back in September. Lawrence and Bennett both pleaded guilty to drink driving, and they were fined 6 weeks' wages by the club. And at Derby Magistrates Court, they were ordered to carry out 180 hours of unpaid work. They gave them a 12-month community order and banned them for driving for 2 years. But Keogh was sacked by the club, and he sustained a serious knee injury in that crash that could leave him out for 15 months in total. Supposedly he was sacked because he was the club captain, and there's all this extra responsibility that goes with that captaincy, as well as being one of the senior players in the squad. But it did, perhaps not surprisingly, raise the question, why did he get such a different punishment from the club to both Bennett and Lawrence? So I suppose the first kind of overarching topic to pick apart is, generally speaking, should we be harsher with punishments for breaches that are this serious? But then, in doing that, did Richard Keogh's punishment seem ridiculously harsh compared to what his teammates got in the same incident?
This may sound quite cynical, what I'm about to say, but could it be a case of that Derby knew that he wasn't going to be playing for a long time and therefore didn't want to pay his wages? Didn't want to pay the wages of a player that wasn't going to appear for more than a year, and have used that to then say, well, actually, what he's done is really bad, and sort of those two combined, and then sack him, which I think is harsh. We hear incidents in women's football. There's been issues over the last few years about how clubs only have to pay injured players for up to 3 months, and then it's after that they don't have to pay them. It did feel quite harsh. But you can understand why they've done it, and from a cynical point of view, it could also be a little cost saving as well.
To go down the cynical point of view as well, and if we look at players as purely financial assets, are Mason Bennett and Tom Lawrence, both young, both approaching their prime, not more of an asset than a 33-year-old Richard Keogh, who's out for 15 months? And think of the resale value that both Lawrence and Bennett have versus Keogh. And this is where I kind of think, if you had sacked Bennett and Lawrence, another team is going to pick them up there and then. Which is why I kind of bring in the Myles Garrett situation here, because it's the league that have taken action against him and suspended him. Across the board, do we need league officials to actually kind of lead the way in punishments, because a club would always have their own vested interests in it as well. Because I bet you anything that if it was up to the Cleveland Browns how long a suspension Myles Garrett got, it probably wouldn't be for the rest of the season, because that damages them for the season, and it's ultimately not their call to make.
Yeah, I'm surprised the EFL haven't really got particularly involved in the Derby situation and imposed bans on the players themselves. I think the leagues being more neutral should be in charge of those sorts of breaches, or not, if not the league, then the FA, the governing body. They did with Bernardo Silva, didn't they? And I think, that's another whole issue about the disproportionate fine that he got compared to what the entire Bulgarian FA got. That's another debate for another day. But they were harsh on him, considering that the teammate in question, Benjamin Mendy, said he wasn't particularly offended by it, but they felt like they had to take a stance and show that there's no place for any sort of, not in his case, not racism, but cultural insensitivity, and they have come down with a hard stance. And I think that was probably a very good move by them. So, yes, I think the league and the NFL have come down with a really hard stance on Myles Garrett because of the issues surrounding concussion in their sport at the moment. It's brought a lot of bad reputations, a lot of bad names to the NFL, and the idea of battering someone around the head with a helmet and causing a serious head injury potentially is not going to reflect well on them. So they've had to take action, and they've punished him quite severely. So yes, I think the leagues are in the best position to hand out punishments, and if it's I'd rather a punishment be too harsh than too lenient. Unless if I was being the one punished.
Well, obviously, yes. If I was a Cleveland Browns fan, I'd probably be a bit annoyed, but I think I'd be more annoyed about Garrett, because if I pick apart that incident specifically, and we put aside sort of the balmy nature of it, the fact there was 8 seconds remaining of the game,
and the fact that he hasn't really apologised for it. He's just come out and said it was a foolish thing to do, which isn't an "I'm sorry, that was ridiculously bad of me."
But this was put in an article on The Athletic. We could legitimately have seen the death of Mason Rudolph on live TV. That's how serious that incident is. I look at incidents that I've reported on in local news where one punch in the head can transform your life like that. Jack Rutter, perfect example, previous guest on this podcast. His path was sort of laid out by that one punch he suffered in a pub when he was out celebrating a Youth Cup semi-final win, and he had to retire off the back of that punch. So imagine having that loaded by what is essentially a professional athlete. Imagine the force he can deliver, but then you add the weight of an NFL helmet onto it as well. He's lucky that Mason Rudolph isn't pressing criminal charges, because he'd had every right to. But I kind of wonder, for stuff like that, do we need to sort of have a zero tolerance threshold for things that are as serious as that, where it is an outright sacking rather than just a long-term suspension for however long it might be, because we don't know now. But for things like assault, you've got to wonder how you can realistically come back from that.
Yeah, again, then are you talking about assault just on the pitch, or are you talking about if someone commits an assault or something more serious off the pitch that isn't related to the sport but is still a criminal offence?
The argument is that it's not that it's forgivable or excusable, but people deem it more excusable on a pitch because you're in a pumped up environment rather than if you were just walking down the street, for example. And that's kind of, from the opinion pieces I've read surrounding the Garrett issue, is that essentially that's his job, is to tackle people to the ground in an aggressive manner. So you'd expect him to be pumped up, which I kind of understand that line of thinking.
Yeah,
but then there's still a line.
It never says in the textbook to rip the opponent's helmet off and hit them with it.
And it's not an immediate thing. He thinks about it first. There's a fair chunk of time between him ripping it off and deciding to leather him over the head with it. But I suppose this kind of comes into my overall thinking. What I want to pick apart here is, how do we categorise these levels of discipline or discipline breaches, because you've got things like this, the violence, but then we talk about the racism issue, for example, and how, in terms of what we've seen from punishment dished out to players, for example, I think of Luis Suarez, who was found guilty of racist abuse by the FA.
Well, and his biting as well. That's another story.
And the biting. But in terms of punishment, we seem to be putting it far lower down from, say, betting, which we've seen players get 1.5 year, 2-year bans for. Again, it's a matter of opinion. From a cultural standpoint, I suppose we see racism as a more disgusting thing, but then there's the betting side where you kind of are bringing the sport into disrepute as an entity by committing a breach like that.
But then aren't you bringing the sport into disrepute by
I would argue
through racism, especially if it is an entire crowd, or maybe not an entire crowd, but a large section of the Bulgarian crowd? They got full punishment, but if half of the Bulgarian team had been found guilty of betting or spot fixing or something like that, they would have got seriously punished for it. Everything, I think things need to be weighed up proportionally, and obviously there always needs to be considered mitigating circumstances if there are any. But I think we need to look at the current punishment system and think, should certain offences be taken more seriously in this current climate? Because racism 20, 30 years ago, I wasn't just going to say it's a lot more acceptable, because racism has never been acceptable in any walk of life, but it was almost more frequent. And now we're having a lot of incidents at the moment, but it's so, the tolerance levels to it are null now compared to previously. So, but yet this still feels like the punishments are sort of the punishments that were dished out 20, 30 years ago. So it feels like there just needs to be an overhaul of the whole thing, the whole punishment system. And I think, as I said previously, punishments need to be harsher than more lenient. But obviously you need to take in mitigating circumstances.
I agree with the harsher punishment side of things, but I also kind of want the consistency as well across all sports. Because I look at the racism, which we're all disgusted by, but then I look at Israel Folau and the homophobic messages he sent, which he's repeated yesterday, by the way. For anyone who didn't pick up on the news recently, because I think I told you this before we started recording, is that the Australian bushfires that are happening at the moment, and Israel Folau's reported to have saying that it's God's way of punishing same-sex marriage is Australian bushfires, which again is another horrible thing to say. But we go back to when he had his Rugby Australia contract cancelled for the things he said. But then would that be replicated across other sports? And what if it was racist abuse that was dished out? Would you get a similarly harsh ban?
The thing is with Israel Folau is that he has his religion to hide behind, and if you punish him, it's like you're punishing someone for their religious beliefs, and you're punishing Christians.
But then what about Margaret Court, who granted isn't playing anymore, but people have been saying take her name off of the court at the Australian Open, but she holds many of the same sorts of views as Israel Folau.
Which is the point I'm trying to make here, is that I don't think there are any religions out there, the non-extreme versions of these religions, where it says that you should treat anyone differently because of their skin colour. That has been born out of humans and the whole class system, and that from hundreds of years that's carried on and is now being finally whittled out. Whereas and punishing someone for being racist, it doesn't feel like you're punishing like an entire group of people. Whereas Israel Folau and people who are homophobic often have the religious argument behind them, and that can cause all sorts of issues if you're giving someone severe punishment for saying what is their religious belief, which I don't necessarily agree with, but I can see why maybe the punishments aren't quite as harsh. But it'd be interesting to see what the governing body, the international governing body of rugby league, do now. He said he's going to come back and play for Tonga, I think it was, or was it Australia? I can't remember which one. But now, in fact, he's going to come back. He said he's going to come back and play international rugby league now, and then he's made these comments again. Surely they've got to do something.
You would think. But to throw another category out there, doping. Obviously one of the most serious breaches of discipline for an athlete that you can put out there. But how often have we argued that the punishments there aren't long enough? How many times have we seen people found guilty of doping take their ban, come back, and just carry on where they left off, essentially?
I think if someone is found guilty of doping, that's a lifetime ban from sport. If it was found, again, because I'm going to slightly contradict myself, if it was blindingly obvious that it was done for performance enhancing gains, because Kolo Touré, he got a 6-month doping ban, didn't he, for accidentally taking his wife's diet pill or something like that, had a banned substance in it. So again, mitigating circumstances, but I think on the whole, punishments for doping need to be harsher, and that's not just for individuals, that's for countries as well.
Shall I then throw out what I sort of would like to see going forwards, is that every sport, every league, however you want to see it, has an independent panel with some clearly publicised, set out guidelines, and that's they're the ones who decide who gets banned, what the punishments are for these serious breaches, rather than sort of doing it on an ad hoc basis at the moment from sport to sport, where we've got clubs deciding in some cases, and then we've got national governing bodies deciding in another case, and we've got league governing bodies deciding on another case. And perhaps that's the best way to get the consistency that we're perhaps asking for across the board from sport to sport.
Yeah.
Where a doping ban should be the same in football as it should be in athletics.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think an independent panel would be the way forward. But then also, if a club or a governing body wanted to fine that athlete on an individual basis as well, on top of what he's already been received, or she, then that should be an option as well. But actually, I think that's a very sensible idea, Alasdair. Have you thought of a career in sports politics?
Thank you. Don't talk to me about politics. Too much in my past.
Sports politics.
Any type of politics, really. To throw out the cynical question then, to kind of finish this off, do sports people, as the highly valued commodities that they are, do they get a greater sense of protection than any regular member of society?
It feels that way. I always use Marlon King as the example. And you can use Luke McCormick as well. Luke McCormick, the Plymouth goalkeeper, killed two young boys in a hit and... Was it hit and run? He was definitely drink driving. I can't remember if it was a hit and run, but he was sentenced to several years in prison. But he came back and was sort of allowed to resume his job as a professional footballer. Whereas if you thought, for example, I don't know what if you a journalist had done that, it would be very difficult to find work as a journalist again, wouldn't it? If you had a conviction like that. And Marlon King, some of the crimes he was convicted for were disgusting, but he still managed to come back and play professional football time and time again.
Luke McCormick was causing death by dangerous driving.
Death by dangerous driving. But still a very serious crime. And yes, he did own up to it, and he did admit that he was in the wrong, and he did serve his time. But the fact that he was able to come back and play professionally again was one that was very controversial. And again, like I said previously, would you have seen that with other people in other professions? And I always use Marlon King as the example. He should never have been allowed anywhere near a football pitch after what he did. But yet he was time and time again. I mean, both of those examples are football. But should they have been allowed to come back? Probably not.
Exactly. But I think going forward, we can all argue for the consistency that we'd like to see. So, and if anyone wants to take up my idea, that would be great. Thank you. Before we round up this section, it's 5-0 now. Man City, West Ham. Tessa Woolett with the 5th. And Georgia Stanway's been sent off.
Sent off?
Yes, she has.
Scored twice and a red card.
Very eventful day for her.
I look forward to watching the highlights.
Anyway, yes, make sure you watch all the highlights tonight. There's plenty of goals in this one. Just not if you're a West Ham fan. It's not going to be a great viewing. Anyway, some final messages to come after this quick break.
You can subscribe to SportSpiel on Audioboom, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio on demand.
Right, that is almost it for this particular episode. of the podcast. We are going to be back next week, but not strictly we, because there's a new person taking over as host. Who is it?
It is the one and only Laura Gallagher. Having previously been a guest twice, she is now hosting her own episode, welcoming on not one, not two, but 3 special guests over the course of an hour. Don't want to give too much information away at the moment, but for those of you who may be a bit sick of our voices, it's the perfect opportunity to stay around. Laura is a great host. I've already heard one of her interviews, and it's really, really interesting. And I can't wait.
Exactly. More will be revealed on social media, which is the perfect plug for you to go and follow us if you don't. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. All of our handles are SportSpiel Pod, so you can find out all the information about the podcast there, as well as what we've got coming up in December too, because there's plenty coming up, including our ever favourite review of the year, which we will do, because that's kind of become a little bit of a staple once that perspective year comes to an end. So if you've got any suggestions or any highlights that you want to flag up to us that we perhaps should mention, get in touch. You can also email us sportspielpod@gmail.com if you've got anything you want to highlight. Other than that, do we have any exciting sporting plans ourselves?
I would just say keep an eye on the Great Britain hockey channels over the next few weeks. We may have a little bit of an insightful mini documentary coming your way.
Ooh,
that's all I'm saying.
That's a perfect plug. Somehow I don't think my work is quite so interesting at the moment. We do have a general election coming.
No,
can
we not talk about that?
The night before our Christmas party.
It's the night of my work Christmas party, but I'm actually going out to the theatre with my family instead, so we'll be avoiding that.
No, I'm doing the all-nighter on the general election, then it's Christmas party on the Friday night, and then the Chelmsford City Fencing Club Christmas party on the Saturday night. So don't expect me to be particularly energetic on the Sunday. I don't know if we're recording then yet, but if we are, I'll have to take in a lot of coffee.
I can't that day. I could do the Saturday, but not the Sunday.
Okay.
So there we go.
Oh God, this is going to be interesting. Anyway, with that is the end of today's discussion episode, listeners. Do take care until then, and we will see you very soon.